Okay. Let's get started. Right now, the executive branch is making the claim that it has the right to kill anyone, anywhere on Earth, at any time, for secret reasons, based on secret evidence, in a secret process, undertaken by unidentified officials. If that frightens you, as much as it frightens Sebastian and I, you should be affirming with us today. We are proud to affirm today's resolution. The United States federal government should end all drone strikes in the Middle East and South Asia. Before we go into more detail about why we are affirming today, I'd like to thank everyone here for making this debate possible and jump right into some resolutional analysis. First, going over some quick definitions, the USFG, just to clarify, is not the Facetters Guild. We will be talking about the federal government today. Should is going to indicate that this is a policy round, meaning that my partner and I will be presenting and advocating for a plan. Ending all drone strikes will be clarified by our plan itself, and in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, it's just whatever we consider to be the Middle East traditionally, and South Asia is basically just there so we can talk about Pakistan too. Okay, so with that, jumping right into the plan. The plan is that as soon as possible, the United States federal government will end all Middle Eastern and South Asian drone strikes. There will be no funding necessary, and this will be enforced by the DoD. Yes?
What does as soon as possible mean?
Now.
Okay.
Now.
Cool.
Now. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, one of the most important parts of this debate is going to be the standard, which we will be setting as the preservation of rights. Since we are acting as representatives of a government, it is essential for us to keep in mind the rights of both our citizens and the citizens of the global community. This means that the burdens for this round mean that the negation must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are going to be providing the maximum amount of rights for humankind because they're conducting immediate and extrajudicial killings, meaning that this obligation to prove beyond a reasonable doubt has been moved from a trial to the very existence and usage of our drone program. With that, let's move on to our first contention. That is the murder of innocence. It is a commonly espoused fact, or perceived fact, that drones are efficient at killing their targets and only getting their targets. I can guarantee that Taylor and Nick are going to come up here and say, hey, drones are the best way to do this. They're better than any other method that we could use. And that's simply not true. That is nothing but a collection of lies. One of my students said last week in a practice debate that drones are effective because they never hit anywhere like schools or anywhere crowded. They never have collateral damage like that. Unfortunately, that student had fallen prey to the same societal lack of knowledge that most in America have because of how the government covers up this information. The sad truth is, though, that this student knew just as much about the targets of drone strikes as do most of the drone operators themselves. Yes?
So what is your ideal method for killing suspected terrorist targets?
So I have a couple responses to that because that is a very complex question. What we think is that A, the ideal situation is not killing anyone at all, because killing anyone in most situations is bad, and we think that actually the best way to address the perceived problem of terrorism is not through any conventional warfare, it's through trying to build a more successful nation that can improve the quality of lives of its own citizens without war itself. So continuing on, what we really need to look at here is that according to independent news sources that get information from around the government, the actual recipients of drone strikes can be anywhere from cafes and schools crowded with innocent children to mosques and the very paramedics trying to revive those taken out by the drone strikes minutes before. Now, we excuse this senseless killing across the world because this data about these attacks is monopolized and classified by our government that keeps us from learning anything about it. But the numbers that we see out of this system are that just 2% of those killed by drone strikes are high-ranking terrorists. The remaining 98% is a mix between low-level militants and simply civilians. Now, the really scary part is what the U.S. government actually defines as a militant. A militant, according to the CIA, when it comes to the casualties of drone strike, is simply any male in their teens or to their middle age who they think could possibly be a combatant, or the family of anyone who they think is a terrorist member. That is simply absurd. And according to the real in-depth polls of Pakistanis, only 16% think drones hit militants effectively, which means we're turning 84% against us. This means that on top of the thousands of dead innocents, including hundreds of dead children, we're creating new enemies. That's why so many people have come out and said that drones are actually increasing the amount of terrorists going against the US. The numbers range between 3 and 40 new active enemies of the United States for every one person killed in a drone strike. That is a simply immense number that cannot be overwhelmed. Continuing on to contention 2, that is the damaging of government legitimacy. The first subpoint here is on the idea of not having a trial. This ruins the American and international concept of trial by jury and trial before execution. We combine the trial, the judge, and the jury. We combine all of that together and make the drones the executioner. This is similar to what we saw in The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movie with Bane, where we suddenly put the Scarecrow in charge of the entire justice system and just have him kill everyone. If you thought that that was a just system in that movie, you can feel free to negate. But if you recognize that that's not the way to do things, you should be siding with us. This also, by using drones, gives Americans the ability to conduct flyovers without external government permission, impeding on governmental sovereignty around the world, where we're simply sending our terrifying hovering monsters to just stay above them, where these people recognize that, hey, I might be blown up by an American drone at any second. Oh well, might as well just go live my life. Now, we are increasing the likelihood of war. We're mechanizing war, which actually dehumanizes our enemies even further, because this isn't some sort of Call of Duty video game where we can just sit down and blast our opponents to smithereens. That is not our objective. Our objective is to decrease attacks, not increase attacks. To decrease war, not increase war. To preserve human rights and not to destroy them. For all of these reasons, Sebastian and I are proud to propose.
What is ASAP? What's the first question? What is the soonest possible?
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks to our competitors. This is going to be a great round. I think that they use scare tactics and strategic lies to try and tell you that one of the most efficient military technologies that saves American lives, that ends the lives of terrorists, that terrorize not only our own citizens abroad, but the people who live within those countries. These are very valuable technologies that have saved us money, have saved us lives, and we ought to continue to have them as a tool in the toolbox for the war on terror and for global safety overall. So I'm going to provide you with our standards, I'm going to give you our off case, and I'm going to refute what we heard from the affirmation. So first of all, we're going to absolutely counter what we think are kind of ridiculous standard. Their standard was preservation of rights. I think they need to actually tell us what that means, because we think probably the most fundamental right is the right to life, which is protected by things like national security, not just it's bad when people's rights are abridged because we use like drone strikes. The whole point of national security is the massive preservation of rights on a state level, right? And we think that also their standard of like beyond a reasonable doubt is an absurd burden that they have given us no justification for why we ought to advance within this round, right? So the standard that we're going to advance is we're going to tell you net benefits for the United States federal government. We think that this is a state-oriented obligation of trying to maximize the good as the people, the like sovereign state that provides for their citizens, right? So we're going to be advancing that standard. The first point that I want to advance is that this better fulfills the moral obligations of the US federal government. So recognize that we opt into what we call a social contract as citizens of a state. Basically, we give up certain rights, we do things like pay taxes, agree to abide by laws, and in return, we assume that the government is going to provide us certain essential protections. So this is things like providing for national security, which is sort of the relevant one in this particular case. But the point of this is that the United States federal government has first and foremost a primary and overriding obligation to its own citizens, not citizens of the world, because those citizens do not opt into the social contract, do not pay taxes, do not participate in our civil process, and are not part of the obligations of the US federal government in that way. So we can have secondary considerations about the well-being of others, but providing for the well-being of the state is the first and only obligation of the United States federal government. But we think that beyond this, it means that we also have to care about the efficiency and efficacy of how we provide things like national security, right? So we have a moral duty, for example, to keep troops from harm's way where it can be avoided. We think that this is hugely important, right? If the United States federal government was sending our soldiers into places without guns or helmets or various protective gear, that would be considered wildly immoral and negligent on the part of the United States government. But the inaction of not using the best technology possible is the exact same abuse of those soldiers who are offering up their lives, their security, their safety to serve our country in national defense. So, we tell you, insofar as drones are unmanned aircraft that allow us to have far better ability to protect and to fight within these regions, we have an obligation to those soldiers that serve us to actually use them. But we think that beyond this, there's a moral argument because it's better than any of the alternatives. Like, they said we were going to say this, they didn't ever really say why it was wrong. I'm going to give you all the reasons. They were like, it's a pack of lies. Here's a whole bunch of words and arguments, right? So here's the really terrible government bind that they're in. They're going to have to answer it in this round. They cannot win the round without telling us which of these three options or some alternative option is going to come true on their side of the house. Because insofar as they're ending drone strikes, there are three possible outcomes. So first, they keep doing principally the same thing, like trying to kill terrorists within these countries, but you do it in less effective ways, such as airstrikes or boots on the ground, right? Like through manned jets, those sorts of things. This means you have the exact same harms. You're still bombing the crap out of Yemen, you're still bombing the crap out of Pakistan, but you're now doing it by putting people in harm's way. I'll get to all the reasons those are less effective, all of those things. So basically they do the same thing but worse. The second option, there's two basically, the other two options are both if we basically totally stop drone strikes and let the local governments take over dealing with these things, right? There's two ways this can go. The worst case scenario is that because often these governments are highly corruptible and they have really poor security apparatus, it just means they end up actually helping the terrorists. Like in Pakistan, high levels of the army have been bought out by groups like the Taliban. They're very bad at keeping those things from not being infiltrated, right? So the worst case scenario is they actually aid the terrorists and we have no countervailing security apparatus that is trying to do anything about dismantling things like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Pakistan Taliban, all these sorts of things. The best case scenario, because of their limited military capacity as compared to the United States, is they basically do things like torture terrorists to try and find out locations and plans. And this is a huge morally repugnant abrogation of rights that we ought to prevent against. We would rather just do a really highly effective surgical strike against these groups, right? So that's the bind they have to answer. Which of those three things is going to be preferable? We tell you, keep using the really effective drones. Which brings me to my second point, which is this is extremely technically effective. Recognize that drones are extremely surgical and they kill fewer civilians than almost any other alternative because of several reasons. I think I have 5. So first, they're highly accurate. Compared to a jet traveling at 1,000 miles per hour with a pilot that has to push a button at the exact right moment, you have extreme surgical precision in the way that you're able to actually automate and fire these various attacks, right? Second, the decisions when drones strike are made by a group of 10 commanding officers. That is literally the operating protocol. 10 commanding officers in a room making the decision, looking at the screen, deciding what to do, as opposed to a pilot who is in the heat of the moment, flying a plane, worried about attacks, worried about his own safety, and trying to make an independent decision while talking to one CO over his radio. They're not as well trained as those 10 individuals in the security of some bunker making the same decision, right? Then they can also stay in the sky for ages. It means that you have a better opportunity to strike when the time is right, minimize those casualties. You're not like, well, yeah, there's a bunch of school children crossing out of the way, but this is the only chance we have to do it. Just leave the drone in the air for another 45 minutes, wait till those kids are out of there, then do it. That's way preferable. And they can also surveil, those sorts of things. And also the technology keeps improving every year. We keep improving these drones. It means they get better and more accurate every single time. They can also get into tricky geographic areas, like the vast deserts of Yemen, and they're really freaking quiet, right? You can hear a jet or a chopper coming from miles away. This gives them an opportunity to get into safer areas. You're less likely to get your target and still have all the destruction. It's just way less effective. So basically, drones are the freaking bomb, pun intended. All right, third, this is extremely effective as a policy for counter-terror. So first of all, it targets leaders. Recognize that often terrorist groups really rely on the charisma of their leaders to actually be able to persuade individuals to join up in the fight and to be able to execute plans. So that means that when we kill off those top leaders, which we've been super effective at, Al-Qaeda is basically done because of drone strikes, it means they just have to replace them with worse leaders. This means you have less recruitment, they're less effective. Weigh that against all the other stuff they told you about, how people get mad about drones and then join up. It's way more devastating devastating to have like the Osama bin Laden just running reign over these entire cells, right? But it also disrupts cells in their hierarchy, means that they're totally that way. But it also creates huge amounts of deterrence, because it means that they literally can't cluster outside in large groups. That means that you can't do things like training, you can't organize, they have to keep their communications near silent, otherwise they're going to be located. This means there's a huge cost, like materially and just in terms of their capacity to operate. That means that they are not able to train and plan effectively. This is why those terror plots have been less effective. Okay, going on to their on case, a lot of this is going to cross-apply. They talk about killing of innocents. Their entire first point, they spend a huge amount of time basically being like, collateral damage happens. Like, yes, but collateral damage doesn't have to reach 0 for it still to be comparatively better, right? Like, war unfortunately has collateral damage. Civilians sometimes die. They haven't given us a proper explanation of what they're going to do where nobody dies, right? Nick asks direct POIs, like, what's your alternative for killing terrorists? They're like, well, we'd like to kill nobody. Okay, like if someone's like, we're trying to kill mass amounts of people, we want to hold like mass amount of land, we want to establish an Islamic caliphate, those people are doing stuff. Inaction is death. Inaction is a threat to the security of people domestically and abroad. They can't just say, like, amorphously, like, we do diplomatic things. Like, you think if that was so easy, like, why are we just going straight to war? War's really expensive. You can't do everything diplomatically. These are often violent individuals that have violent intentions. They say, like, look, we're creating new enemies, 30 to 4 new commands per kill. 1, this is not unique to using other attacks. 2, they would just use other propaganda if we weren't using drones. It's not like the US is like a perfect actor other than drones. They would find other ways to recruit people. 3rd, where did they possibly get this number, like 3 to 40 new combatants? Like, okay, well, our study says that every time we kill one of these leaders, that limits them recruiting 1,000 new people. And so it's really effective because they were really charismatic, and now we minimize that, right? They're like, people live in fear, so do other methods. They say that it creates war like video game. It's unclear to me why dropping some bomb from a jet flying 1,000 miles per hour is any more or less dehumanizing than actually looking at people on a screen that's relatively clear and making a decision with 10 qualified people about if they're going to kill someone or not. All these reasons, proud to oppose.
You're here.
Watch his second speaker. He's going to bring this up.
How's everyone doing? You debaters, are you like when you see stuff? Alright, cool. Alright, everyone ready to begin? And I'll begin in time. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the hall, allow me to first extend a thanks to you all for spending your afternoon with us. I'll first be going over the resolutional analysis that my partner provided and they had a bit of an issue with before going into the negation team's case and finally the affirmations team's case. Now let's first begin with the analysis. They changed our standard to net benefits to the United States. We'd agree with the net benefits part, but not the United States. We say that as a moral actor, the United States has to take into consideration the lives of other people. They seem to really try this tactic of diminishing the lives of foreign citizens. But we have to recognize that life is an irreversible impact. Life is something that is precious and belongs to everyone equally. This is something that we have to take into consideration. You can't just say, well, because they're not part of the United States, that means that we can't really take into consideration their life. That's just ridiculous and absurd. But talking about the burden, they say that it's an absurd burden that we didn't provide a reasoning for. Daniel provided you that reason very clearly. He said that their advocacy talks about killing people without trial in an unjust way through secretive means, right? That is a huge burden to prove that that is an effective means, and that's something that we should adopt as an actor. So they have the burden to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning in a courtroom setting, beyond 80 to 85%, that in reality, we have to prove that if we're going to adopt that advocacy, if we're going to adopt that governmental policy. And the reality is I don't think they've done that. When we looked at their case, a lot of it tries to put us in this this triple bind, as they call it, but I'll be explaining that actually right now. Let's go into their first contention, that idea of moral obligations. They talk about how we have a moral obligation to citizens. They never tell you how it is that drones protect our security or what threat these terrorists that we're currently having have to our security, right? They never tell you, look, these terrorists in Pakistan or ISIL are coming to the United States to kill us all, right? But we do have evidence that drones are actually killing citizens on the ground. Currently, 8 U.S. citizens have been killed by drone strikes abroad, so that's 8 for us, 0 for them as far as what these drones are doing to protect citizens. But additionally, we point out that by trivializing war, this turns their argument about how we need to stop troops from being in harm's way. This is the logic of trivializing war. When our war is fought on a computer screen with just drone strikes and with things that are cheap, that don't put people in harm's way, that trivializes war. That makes us go, okay, war isn't very costly. War doesn't cost us much. There aren't lives at risk. Let's go bomb some people. It's something that makes war a very realistic option and disincentivizes alternative means of establishing hegemony, namely soft power and economics, which have been proven to be effective with our recent Iran deals. There are other ways to get what we want that don't have to do with bombing people. And that brings me right into this triple bind that they talk about. They tell you that we have to choose between, leaving the region alone or bombing. But they ignore the fact that the U.S. can have a hand in this region without bombing people. Namely the fact that we are still in favor of intelligence drones and satellite intelligence, things that are incredibly useful to forces on the ground. Recognize that in the fight against ISIL, it isn't the U.S. that's leading the charge. It's Iraq and the Kurds and Jordan that have been killing the majority of ISIL fighters and retaking the majority of land. In fact, back in February, it was the Kurdish forces, not the U.S., that took back Mosul, the second largest city and province in Iraq. It is other foreign governments that are doing the work against terror. We can help them, but we shouldn't, and we have no moral right to be killing these people in whatever way we deem fit. So we're going to, I guess, opt for the way in which we allow these foreign governments to help. And to this Pakistani argument, I'd point out that they never tell you exactly how much corruption is going on. They just say, hey, Pakistan's really bad. But recognize that Pakistan is far more of a moral actor to be executing terrorists than we are. We have no place introducing our line of justice and our reasoning into these foreign countries, especially not when it is these other countries that are doing the work for us. So really that addresses a lot of their offense, because a lot of their offense is geared towards, well, airstrikes are really bad, ground troops are really bad. Okay, we agree. We aren't advocating for either of those two things. Recognize that they have introduced to you the first logical fallacy you'll hear about this week, false dichotomy. They're creating this world in which you have to choose between airstrikes and drones. You don't have to make that choice. You don't have to make that decision. Recognize that in our world where we don't use drones and we don't use airstrikes, local governments are far more effective at eliminating the threats to their own countries, and they're far more effective. Local troops have a much higher incentive to save civilian lives than foreign troops do, because they're locals. They're people who actually care about the well-being of their own citizens. Thus, they are far better at preserving security and reducing reducing casualties than drone strikes are, or basically U.S. intervention. So that addresses a lot of their arguments about surgical precision, and they talk about how there are 10 commanders, but as Daniel said in his speech, this is a really sketchy process. This is a really sketchy process that we really don't know what criteria that they use, especially when he reads to you that their criteria for a militant, somebody who they regularly target, is just somebody from their teens to middle age who happens to be male or their families. Recognize that this is a very, very weird criteria that they use, so just because there are 10 commanders, that doesn't at all make them a good option for us to look at. Their third and final argument is this idea of target leaders. They say that drones are really good at this, but to this we say, look, there's a hydro effect when it comes to terrorism. In reality, we saw when we destroyed Al-Qaeda, ISIL arose. How did that happen? Because all of the disjointed figures and branches from Al-Qaeda moved to ISIL. When you cut off one head of the Hydra, 3 more pop up. We create more enemies. So yeah, sure, we might kill a leader. We kill Osama bin Laden. Woohoo! We still have ISIL to deal with. Look, the reality is that when the U.S. projects its force, when we attack these countries, only more devastation occurs, and we only cause more reasons for them to hate us. They tell you that when they're addressing our case, that, well, they'll still find ways to recruit them. Don't give them more. The reality is that this is like saying, okay, there's a mob over there with a bunch of shotguns. Let's just give them AKs since they already have guns. No, you don't give them more ammunition. You don't give terrorists even more ways to fight us and to undermine our interests abroad. Let's go to the Aft case. Our first contention is about the murder of innocence. And they talk about how, again, they cross-apply a lot of their offense, but they talk about how inaction is death. Recognize that U.S. inaction doesn't mean inaction at all. Recognize that there are other actors besides the United States who are taking greater action than we are, namely Jordan and the coalition that we are currently fighting ISIL with. We do not have to be the ones bombing people. We can be the ones helping and supplying information through intelligence drones. And then their second response here was talking about how, well, where did they get that number, right? It's such a sketchy number. First of all, University of Chicago, but second of all, let's think of the logic here. If your house gets blown up with all of your children inside it, you're probably going to be a little peeved. You're probably not going to be a huge fan of the United States, so the logic behind creation of terrorists is far better on our side of the house than it is on theirs. And our second contention about trivializing war, I already talked about. They talk about how well that happened with airstrikes. True. Again, false dichotomy. We do not have to choose between drones and airstrikes. We choose between drones and no drones. And we, on our side of the house, are proud to advocate for no drones. I hope you'll stand with us. Thank
Nick is probably going to kill him. Okay, but.
His face is so red. I wrote down so much.
He did a big highlight. All
right.
Last year.
I'm gonna need like a page.
You guys ready?
Yeah.
So, Sebastian and Daniel have officially entered the fairy tale world of rainbows and unicorns, where they have decided not only are we going to end drone use, but they suddenly get to caveat and fiat that we're going to stop bombing in general. Unfortunately for them, the affirmative side of a debate round does not get that power. They do not get to decide that we are no longer going to drop any bombs whatsoever. Why is this the case? If they end drone use on their side of the house, the American population is not going to be satisfied with pulling out of the Middle East in general. The political will, way out of work, the political will on our side, on their side of the house, is going to lead to the American government to be more in support of airstrikes, more in support of putting boots on the ground, because the voters in America are not satisfied with doing nothing about the Middle East. They support these drone strikes for a reason. The drone strikes are the best alternative. They do not get to decide that in their magical world where we don't kill anybody, it gets to stay that way in perpetuity. Let's get into the arguments. First of all, how should you judge this round? Because they seem to make the argument that we should only judge the round valuing each life the same in the world. So look, that sounds great. I'm sure that pulls on your intuitions that every life is the same. Unfortunately, it's not how the real world works. So let's get out of the world of rainbows and unicorns and back into the real world as to how the American government actually operates when it's making decisions. Here's how it operates. We protect our own citizens first. Why is this the case? Because Taylor gave you all of the arguments which went unresponded to, which is the American citizens actually pay taxes. The American citizens have entered into the social contract and expect that protection in return. And if you really don't buy this, ask yourself this question. Why don't we dissolve the entirety of the American welfare system and donate all of that money to Africa? It would save a hell of a lot more lives because the marginal utility for that money would be much better and much higher in Africa. We could save millions of lives instead of just giving basic shelter and food to people in America. But I'm sure they wouldn't support that policy. But if you're not supporting that policy, they need to make a distinction in the PMR as to why they wouldn't. Because obviously, if you value each life individually the same across the world, then you would divest your entire budget as a state across the world to save as many lives as possible. It's not how the real world works. I'm sorry, you shouldn't judge the round that way. Instead, you should judge how we can actually benefit American lives the most. And then they say, no. We have to have a beyond a reasonable doubt standard because this isn't using a trial. No, this is also not how the real world works because you don't grant trials to people who are pointing guns at you and shooting you, right? Think of this like self-defense. If we do not actually take out these terrorist networks, they are going to attack us. This has been empirically true. This is also true in theory. Sebastian goes, no. We've killed 8 civilians and 0 have died according to you. How about the 6,000 soldiers that have died in the Middle East as a result of terrorist actions? Those are lives, so 6,000 to 8 if we're going to do a scoreboard. Sorry, that's not how you should judge a debate round. On our side of the House, in the status quo, we use drone strikes, therefore we deter terrorist attacks. So it is true that we have had very few terrorist attacks. That is while using drones to deter terrorist attacks. We are showing that we are effective on our side of the House. Furthermore, though, there are terrorist attacks that have been attempted. On July 4th, the reports have come out that we stopped over 10 terrorist plots on that day that some of them were ISIL-related. We see that they are attempting to do so, but with the use of drones, with the use of intelligence, we're able to effectively stop them. They directly threaten the United States' lives. No, thank you. So The first argument that we gave you is that we have a moral obligation to our own citizens. They say there's no threat by terrorists. So again, we've said, well, first of all, like 9/11 happened, there was a terrorist attack. Again, add that death toll count to the fact that add the death toll to like our I guess utilitarian calculus where we're keeping score by lives saved. I think that's a problem for them. Second of all, I already gave you the response about how U.S. soldiers are at risk. Third of all, I've already given you the response about the ISIL attempts at terrorist attacks. But fourth of all, I've already given you the response about how we do this in the status quo. There, it's effective. And then they say, no. We don't internalize things when we just look at things through a video game screen, and drones make us not internalize the cost. So what's the logical extent of this argument? So we should maximize the way in which we internalize costs by making us more vulnerable so we really feel the pain? Like, by that logic, we'd strap innocent people to the front of our tanks so that we could really internalize the cost and we wouldn't roll out our tanks unless we really had a risk to ourselves. No, that's ridiculous. We have an obligation to provide the best protection to our soldiers that we can, the best protection to our lives that we can. It doesn't make any sense. Go for it.
Why do we have to use soldiers at all? Under what logic are you operating under that we must use them?
Because you do not get to pretend like the political will in the United States suddenly becomes peace, love, and happiness. We have a lot of people and a lot of politicians that want to intervene in the Middle East. Even so, even if you don't buy that, even if you think that America is made up of rainbows and unicorns and fairies, they still have to bite the harms that terrorists prove or cause a direct threat towards U.S. civilians. So either you are going to use alternative means, which we've already explained to you why it's bad, and they've conceded it as such, or you have to believe that terrorists pose no threat to the United States. Either way is wildly unrealistic. But then I love this argument. They say, no, the local governments are awesome at dealing with this. Let's talk about that. Remember that huge compound that was like double the size of any building in Abbottabad where bin Laden was just hanging out for the past 10 years, from 2001 to 2011? Yeah, Pakistani government was real on top of that one, guys. Like, that's not how the world works. And here's the thing. If they believe that they're in a better position, they need to tell us why Pervez Musharraf admitted in an interview that he tacitly complied with U.S. drone strikes, or why WikiLeaks revealed that Yusuf Raza Gilani, his successor, actually worked with the CIA to decide where the drone strikes were going to be, even though they publicly condemned it, or why Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh has actually said, according to WikiLeaks as well, that he supports U.S. drone strikes. These local governments want us to intervene because they can't do it themselves. We gave you the reasons why local governments are ineffective, because they're easily bought off. And then they just drop all of our arguments. Well, they concede that drones are effective, right? Like they're saying, oh, we just don't want to kill anybody. But they dropped all of our arguments about why counterterrorism is actually better on our side of the house because of the deterrent factor. So here's the thing. Let's say you're planning a Friday night get-together with your friends. Is it easier to text them and email them, or are you going to give a handwritten letter to your friend and then have them run across the street and give your handwritten letter to your friend? So on our side of the house, we've actually had success at making sure that we are cutting communication lines. So for example, Al-Qaeda in Mali got a memo one day that says, hey guys, don't gather together and don't send wireless messages because the U.S. will drone you. Which means that when you were planning if you think it would be hard to plan a Friday night get-together that way, imagine trying to plan a terrorist attack that way. It's really ineffective when you have to communicate using handwritten notes and using code and not actually gathering together, which means we actually get more deterrence on our side of the house. We've proven to you why we're better on our side of the house in terms of deterring terrorists. We've proven to you why we're better on our side of the house at actually making sure that the United States is fulfilling its own philosophy, which is looking out for its own people. For these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
All right, everybody ready? All right, thanks everyone for a great round. Pleasure to debate with Nick. This is a great time. We're going to show you why we definitively won this round. So first of all, how should you adjudicate this round? Because we've seen a lot of standards debate this round, and I think that's great. But I think that both in my speech and in Nick's MO, we tell you the superiority of our standard, which is net benefits from the perspective of the United States federal government. And we give you extensive words about how the social contract functions and how we ought to adjudicate through this lens, right? They basically try to appeal to the sense of kumbaya humanity, that we have to adjudicate all lives as being equal. This simply does not function because we're telling you this is about a U.S. federal government policy that is concerned about how they can best serve those citizens, best provide for their security. This is absolutely the first first and primary priority. But even if you buy their standard, that we ought to have the entire world be like equally considered when we're having state policies be adjudicated, which is insane, I remind you again. Even if you buy that and you just have like a really hippy-dippy view of how states ought to function, we think that we still win this because we tell you the various things that we do in terms of being extremely effective in uprooting terrible terrorist organizations that do things like carry out like, shooting girls in the head for trying to go to school and try to like control these local areas. That is good for everyone. That creates net benefits for the human lives of those regions. And we tell you that taking out terrible violent groups of religious extremists is something that serves the interests of all people. They haven't told us how this isn't true, other than appealing to basically sometimes collateral damage happens when you're trying to fight bad guys. Yeah, sometimes they take out bad guys, bad things happen, but it's a lot better than just letting them run rampant because you have to do the comparative. Debate is a comparative activity. They've never done that. Okay, so what is gov defending, right? This is how Nick does rebuttals, and I really like it, so I'm going to do it. So what is gov defending? They basically run with this insane standard of pacifism, right? They're like, look, not only are we going to stop drone strikes, but we're basically just going to be like totally hands-off in the Middle East and Central Asia or wherever we're talking about, right? We're just going to be like, look, guys, I know we've had some trouble before, but I think you guys can take it from here, right? So they give us really insane reasons to believe this. So there's one just kind of like appeal to fairy world. Like, I know it's really nice, and they're playing on your emotions. It's like, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have war? War is over if you want it. Like, okay, Yoko, but let's deal with the real world, okay? So we tell you that, first of all, there is a real threat. These are often the groups that did things like carry out 9/11, carry out attacks in Benghazi, carry out beheadings within these regions, carry out like localized violence, and try and create vast networks of terrorist cells that run like non-state actors that are trying to do things like get massive weapons and control large areas and create a threat to the West. So there is a real threat. They needed to deal with that, right? And we tell you that even the ways that we have been able to combat this threat exist in a world where we have been doing these drone policies, right? Like the fact that Al Qaeda isn't running rampant is because we just droned the ever-living heck out of their leadership and completely created that, destroyed that, right? So we tell you that's hugely important. But even if you don't believe that there is a real threat of terrorism, it doesn't matter because the US population does, and they won't stand for a completely non-interventionist stance, right? People believe that the Middle East is the biggest threat to American safety. It doesn't matter if they're wrong, it matters that that's how they're going to vote. Those are the people they're going to put in office, and they're going to demand that we do something, and it's going to look a whole heck of a lot worse. It's going to be jets flying over these regions, creating massive bombing campaigns. It's going to be like the 90s under HW again. Like, it's going to be a complete disaster, and it's going to be a lot more involved. And also, because it's going to get worse without these drone strikes that are so effective, we're going to have to do more. We're going to have to do boots on the ground. It's going to be another Operation Freedom, right? But then third, they never actually tell us, okay, even if you buy that right now, we just have this totally blown up threat, they never tell us why, given all of the benefits that drones provide, it shouldn't be a tool in the toolbox if a very apparent threat comes forward. Why we should have to internalize the cost of war in the form of having as many soldiers as possible die anytime we have to combat a real threat to our allies or to our national security. So they never told us why we should at least have it as an option, even if we tailor it to be able to make it more effective, right? So then we talk about, I think that insofar as we tell you that these are massively effective, there are no reasonable alternatives they have ever actually advanced or substantiated within this round other than an appeal to pacifism that is completely politically and practically untenable. I think that we tell you that we also create massive deterrence, that this creates a huge, huge problem for how they're actually able to congregate and run these terrorist organizations, and they had to deal with the counterfactual that if we did not have this program and they knew that they could freely congregate, freely organize, and had almost no one back fighting against them except maybe the Pakistani forces that they bought out or various other local actors that are wildly unprepared and support our usage of drones in this area that secretly ask us to do it to protect their safety. These are the threats that are real. These are the threats they had to deal with, and they never dealt with any of those counterfactuals. They simply told you, look at how effective the world's been with drone strikes. We should stop doing them and expect the same thing to keep happening. No chance. Vote off. You're here.
Okay. Is everyone good? Good? Alright, let's wrap this up. They missed. Time and time throughout this debate, the opposition's arguments have been just as accurate as the drone strike. And by that, I mean not at all. I'm going to be showing you in this final speech how many times and how completely and ubiquitously the opposition has missed our arguments throughout this debate in my final speech. So let's go over a couple major ways in which they've missed our arguments completely. The first one that I want to talk about is this false trichotomy that they bring up, where they try to create this straw man argument about what exactly we're proposing. There are a couple major problems with this. First, our lecture on logical fallacies isn't actually until Thursday. Second, we need to acknowledge that we provide you in our first speech, and continued and extended by Sebastian, this idea that we don't actually need our own intervention. And in addition to that, we tell you that in the status quo, we have drones and strikes going on side by side. They completely miss or ignore, I don't know which it is, the fact that we are conducting multiple of these three awful scenarios that they present at the same time. So they try to create this apocalyptic world in which we're failing to combat the terrorist problem, but they never actually explain why this is any different from the world that we're already living in. So when they fail to actually show you how our policy is going to do anything to exacerbate the harms, that means that their offense in this round completely disappears. Now let's talk about this idea, because they've insisted that we're living in the world of rainbows and butterflies and unicorns and whatever other freaking awesome thing to talk about. Now, there's a slight problem with this. The problem is that the negation seems to be living in this world of like mutants and monsters and all of the things you don't want to deal with. Like, there's a reason that Congress hasn't actually authorized a war on ISIS yet. We aren't full-on fighting ISIS. That's not happening. Now, the people in the US aren't nearly as bloodthirsty as they want you to believe. Now, they try to tell you that we're manipulating the situation. That's just them missing our argument again. We're telling you that people are rational actors, and this is where one of the most crucial arguments that they missed is going to come into play. That being the idea that using drones instead of conventional military weapons actually increases our likelihood of war. I told you this in my first speech, and Sebastian extended it through. We told you that if you have no threat of your own casualties when you're going into a war, that is going to lead to an increased likelihood of war. And I think both teams in this round today have agreed beyond any doubt that war is bad. Whether it's conventional war, whether you're using drones or full-out military boots on the ground, whatever it may be, it's costing money and it's costing lives. So when the opposition team comes up here and tells you that the best way to do this system and the best way to fight the terrorists is by creating even more, that's simply ridiculous. Now let's talk about this completely dropped idea of the Hydra effect that my partner brought up and they say nothing against. Now, we tell you that when you have more terrorists being created, that's obviously bad. But then they refute this, or try to refute this, by saying, hey, it's all okay because we're taking out the leaders and that's going to hurt them. But there's kind of this whole thing where we tried to take out Al-Qaeda and they're like, oh, Al-Qaeda's dead. No, Al-Qaeda is now ISIS. ISIS is rampaging around the Middle East. They're cutting people's heads off. They're doing whatever the hell they want, all because we decided to go in and we're like, hey, drones are the best way to do this. We took him out. Go America, USA, USA. No, that's not how it works. The way it apparently works in the negation world is that killing civilians and starting wars is just as American as apple pie, baseball, and obesity. That's not the world we want to live in. The world we want to live in, and we think that you as the judges of this round should be living in, is one where we respect all human rights as we are obligated as non-biased moral adjudicators to do. That's what you need to be doing in this round. You need to come into this round as an adjudicator of an entire global community like both Sebastian and I have presented to you today. And I want you to ask yourself, when the negation has missed so many of our arguments and conceded to you today that they're only going to be increasing the amount of terrorists, doing nothing to actually combat the amount of fighting that we have to be doing, and only increasing the likelihood of war, why would you vote for a team that has missed so much? I urge you to propose.
You're here.
Thank you.
Wow.
That was the famous